Thank you very much. And Thank you everyone for joining today. Once again, I'm Ariana Hernandez, a project manager at the UCLA Ruskin Center for Innovation, which is the lead contractor for the needs assessment. And I just want to thank everyone for their time and presence here today. And I could go back again. Today we'll be discussing the inadequacy and risk assessments for wastewater systems. But first, I'll hand it over to Danya Jimerson on the wastewater needs assessment to introduce Board Member Morgan for opening remarks.
Thank you, Ariana. I am Danya Jimerson, a senior engineer with the Division of Water Quality, leading the wastewater needs assessment efforts from the State Water Board side. Before I introduce a State Board member and a couple other executive management, I wanted to take a moment to thank the wastewater needs assessment team for their incredible work in preparing for this meeting. These efforts have been actually nonstop since our second advisory group meeting, with only a very brief break over the Christmas, all while managing all the demands and tasks and deadlines of their contract with the State Water Board. I feel truly fortunate for being part of this effort and support the team in any way I can. So due to the importance of this wastewater needs assessment advisory group and its objectives, Water Board staff are present today to publicly affirm their support for the wastewater needs assessment goals, recognizing the significance of this work and offer coordination and assistance where necessary. So specifically, I would like to acknowledge the presence of State Board members Nicole Morgan and Sean McGuire, whose expertise is highly relevant to the wastewater needs assessment. A State Board member, Nicole Morgan, brings valuable experience in wastewater treatment systems and funding mechanisms, particularly through her work with DFA, with the Division of Financial Assistance, both critical components to the wastewater needs assessment and the topics for future discussion within this forum. And a State Board member, Sean McGuire, whose career as an engineer consultant for municipalities and water agencies, combined with his experience with the Division of Financial Assistance, provides him with deep insight into the challenges and opportunities we will be addressing today. So we also have here today from the Division of Water Quality, we have Chief Deputy Director Karen Mogues and Assistant Deputy Director within the Division of Water Quality, and Alisa Kihara. We also have our executive sponsors, Christina Schub from Central Valley Region and Ben Letton within the Lahontan region. So, and now I will leave you with the State Board member, Nicole Morgan, who would like to, this opportunity to share her thoughts and her passion and commitment to the advisory group meeting and the goals of the wastewater needs assessment. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Danya, and thank you for all your hard work on this. So good morning, all. It's great to see everyone again. I would like to thank the advisory group for your time, enthusiasm, and your valuable feedback. Realizing that you're all volunteering your time to help in the development and implementation of the wastewater needs assessment. So the needs assessment's long-term goal is to identify the number of inadequate and at-risk wastewater systems using a transparent, systematic, and replicable method. To achieve this, reliable data from compliance and enforcement efforts, such as violation and enforcement order records, will help determine if a system is inadequate. Monitoring data for wastewater treatment systems is limited, making the process challenging. This is even more challenging for many septic systems around the state, and especially for those septic to sewer systems and other small systems that are impacting many small communities. So we intend to improve this and appreciate the advisory group support. To ensure effective communication, the wastewater needs team has simplified technical details and translated agenda materials to foster an equitable and inclusive discussion environment. Recognizing the diverse expertise and backgrounds of the advisory group members, we strongly encourage everyone to share their input, opinions, and questions, even on technical topics. Please ask questions. Time for Q&A has been allocated after each main presentation, and breakout discussions will provide a safe space for members to engage and contribute to today's discussion on inadequacy and risk assessments. Again, I thank you for your time and commitment to this project.
Thank you, Board Member Nicole Morgan, for your opening remarks and your support. And now I'll hand it over to Greg Pierce from the Wastewater Needs Assessment Project team to provide some opening remarks as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ariana. Thank you, Danya. Thank you, Board Member Morgan. Again, I'm Greg Pierce from UCLA, the principal investigator of the contracted portion of this project. And I just wanted to quickly note, and some of you have voiced in the chat and via email, the remarkable and devastating fires in Los Angeles over the last few weeks. And note that, first of all, that I have personally been quite affected. Others on the project team have been affected, but also I'm sure many of you all on the advisory group and perhaps some state board staff on the line have been affected, and we recognize that. Second, there was at least one request potentially to focus this meeting on the impacts of the fires on wastewater systems. We're not going to be able to do that here. There is actually some work we had already been doing in terms of the risk assessment, looking at wildfire impacts on wastewater systems. That being said, there's several other ad hoc efforts we're undertaking to look at the impacts and have been in touch with LA County as well. And we'll bring those up potentially either at a later advisory group meeting, or at least UCLA is open to holding a separate office hours just on this topic. But again, we don't want to derail the larger project and the efforts that we'll focus on here today, but wanted to acknowledge the personal impacts, professional impacts many of you may be facing, as well as that climate risk and wildfire risk to wastewater systems is an important topic. And with that, I think I will turn it back over to Ariana.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Sounds good. Let me get hold of my slides. Okay, we did it. Yeah, thank you, Greg. Thank you for the opening remarks. And now the wastewater needs assessment team, we wanted just to provide a reminder on the overarching goals of the needs assessment. So again, this assessment is a first of its kind study on sanitation equity. With this effort, we hope to inform the long-term goals of the California water boards to achieve the human right to the water. The first phase of this project has included the baseline assessment of wastewater systems in California and data collection efforts, which we went over at the October advisory group meeting. Phase one also includes developing a risk solution framework, which we'll go over part of that today. Phase two includes publishing a public list and mapping tools of wastewater systems of concern, and then needs and cost analysis for these systems. And lastly, providing a roadmap for after this assessment ends. And then here's a map of where we are now. And then just regarding the phase 1B section, the phase 1B reports, which are the baseline assessment of existing studies and the survey, those reports have been delayed. And when we have an update on those materials, I will let you know, but that's still TBD. And then moving on to phase 1C, that's we discussed the data gathering efforts on the last advisory group meeting. And then today we're reviewing phase 1D, that's why I have the little star, which is developing the inadequacy and risk criteria for wastewater systems. And so this last effort of phase one is the solutions framework, based on definitions established from inadequacy and risk assessment, will establish a list of solutions. And then phase two, which will begin this year, I won't dive into each task of phase two as I've already provided an overview on the last slide. And then this meeting, we wanted to provide a sort of map to let you know where we are and the content of the presentation throughout. So we're getting through opening remarks and introductory slides right now. And then this is all to discuss, but these topics were at the last advisory group meeting. We'll keep you updated on those reports. And I also wanted to reshare the feedback form where we responded to questions or comments from the last meeting on the 3 given topics. So Anna, if you haven't already, you could please place that link in the chat. But now I will pass it back to Greg to review the facilities list.
Yeah, thank you, Ariana. And I do want to say my internet is somewhat bulky, so if I am glitchy or even drop off, I do apologize. But yeah, to continue the conversation, really the lead into the focus of this meeting, I want to remind you regarding what have been calling the facilities list. That is really the focus that we'll be talking about the rest of today. We, or namely our project partners at Office of Water Programs at Sacramento State, gave a full presentation on the construction of the facilities list during the last advisory group meeting, and then they have been doing, they were doing a ton of work before the last advisory group meeting. But since the last advisory group meeting, to refine the list based on your feedback, namely to refine the types of systems that were excluded from the list and the subsequent inadequacy and risk assessments, which you can see on the right-hand side. I'm not going to read out all of the different types of facilities that are included or excluded, but we did, again, try to take into account all of your feedback and refine the list so that we focus on the right systems and communities going forward in this effort. Next slide. We do want to say much of the content in this meeting is technical in nature. We have tried to make it as accessible as possible, but we are diving into the details, especially around the 3 different permit types that comprise the systems that are on the facilities list, as well as board member Morgan noted, a lot of the focus in terms of proposed first draft inadequacy criteria are around specific violation enforcement action and broader compliance measures for particular types of wastewater systems, and those are inherently technical in nature. We also want to note that we may not, or likely will not, have time to address all technical or non-technical questions today. We know we have more than 3 hours, but there's a lot of material because the project and scope is large. And we really want to emphasize that this is beginning of the conversation. These are not final criteria by any means. And we already have 2 office hours as we essentially created. Following the last advisory group meeting and held a meeting in January, we're going to have 2 more office hours already scheduled on February 26th and March 26th. We're also going to have other avenues for feedback and questions on the specific criteria. And again, this stage of the project is really the kickoff of this stage of the project, and this stage will last for several months and throughout 2025, and there will be ample opportunity to review refinements of what we're doing and provide input before anything is made official in the context of the project. And again, there, as board member Morgan already noted, we do have a lot to present today, but we also have opportunities for feedback and discussion after each sort of topical module. And then we have a larger breakout group discussion time and report back at the end of this meeting. But we also, we welcome both non-technical feedback in terms of, examples being project framing, around the definitions and terminology we're using, as well as more technical feedback, comments on specific types of violations or enforcement actions, as well as really the next stage of our work, which we have not completed yet and we're not proposing here, which is around sort of the relative importance of specific variables and how we should measure thresholds of concern for specific, again, types of violations, enforcement actions, or risk factors. So that's a long way of saying we welcome all feedback, and you are all in the advisory group because we think your voice is valuable. So please do all weigh in, even if you're not, up to speed on a particular type of violation that's maybe being talked about. Next slide. Yeah, so that brings us to, again, really the focus of the rest of this meeting, which is around the inadequacy and risk assessments. I'm going to kick us off, and then you'll hear a lot from my colleague, Grace Harrison, who has done a tremendous amount of work leading into this meeting. But you'll hear first from me around the motivation, why are we doing this, and a little bit around the definitions of the terms. And then I'll turn it over to Grace to really dive in. And again, this is the structure of the meeting that we're now in, where I'm introducing the inadequacy and risk assessments, and then we'll dive into the first draft proposed technical details around both inadequacy criteria and inadequacy assessment development, the criteria, risk assessment development, the criteria. Again, after each of those, there will be opportunity for discussion and Q&A. We'll have a break in the middle, and at the end, we'll have breakout groups to discuss and reconvene for final remarks. And we anticipate we're going to have office hours, we're going to have other venues for further discussion and refinement of this work. Again, this is in some ways the beginning of the public discussion around these topics. As a reminder, again, in some ways, and as the executive summary also noted, this discussion in the inadequacy and risk assessments are sort of the first major quantitative steps of the project. We've done a lot of qualitative work as well in the context of the survey report, as well as the baseline studies report. And we've done a lot of quantitative background work, I should say, also, especially our colleagues at Office of Water Programs and UMass and UCLA around data sources. But the inadequacy and risk assessments of the systems on the facilities list are the first quantitative step we're taking in terms of results. I really want to emphasize also that the goal here is not to just stop at all at assessing systems and facilities as inadequate or a risk. The goal is to get systems help and support systems to better serve communities, public health, and the environment. So a lot of the future analysis and discussion will not only be at which systems are inadequate or at risk, but what are the solutions for those systems and what are the costs of those solutions, which is really the second bin of work that we'll start to talk about as soon as the next advisory group meeting. And then finally, how do we pay for it? How can we find affordable solutions? Is there a funding gap existing in our ability to meet the scale of solutions that we need to ensure the outcomes that the state is looking for? Next slide. We're also mandated by our contract to really focus in and in some ways use these exact terms that we are using here in terms of inadequacy or risk. Just to give you the details, phase 1C of the project directs us to establish inadequacy and risk failure definitions and also identify the contributing factors for inadequacy or risk for different system types. That's what we're talking about today. Again, the first draft or version of that. And then we are also obligated, this is not a theoretical discussion, to actually run analysis using the definitions and the specific factors in a quantitative way to produce results and make them public at some point, around which systems are inadequate and at risk across the state. That's phase 2C of the project. Again, we're not stopping there. We'll be looking at solutions and costs and funding and gaps in funding, but these tasks were all baked into the project from the start. In terms of the motivation for, again, fleshing these terms out, first of all, there are not standard definitions of inadequate and at-risk systems that exist in state or certainly federal wastewater regulations. We're aware of some efforts to do that right now, including, AB 805, but this is not all fleshed out currently. So that is, again, part of why this was supported to be part of the contract by the board. The impact of this work is that this would be the first quantitative, it will be the first quantitative effort to define and identify inadequate and at-risk wastewater systems in the state, certainly, but also in the nation at anything like the scale. And then again, I've said it a few times now, but really the desired outcome is not to stop at identifying systems as inadequate or at risk, but to find solutions for them, to find funding and support to enable high-needed wastewater systems to improve compliance, and I think this should say sanitation services, to support the broader goals of the board and sort of the human right to water as far as it pertains to sanitation. And we do want to note, we'll get a lot more into this, but there is a difference between the terms inadequacy and risk. Inadequacy, we're really focusing on systems that are in significant non-compliance, using violation, enforcement, order, and other types of compliance data to determine if the system is currently inadequate. Whereas the risk assessment is really trying to look forward and identify systems that are currently adequate for the definitions and formulas that we're going to be able to use, but are at risk of not becoming so, or to put it more positively, I suppose, of becoming inadequate. And we're currently, you'll hear a lot more about it, looking at 4 different risk categories with different variables to try to analyze and predict those systems that are likely to become inadequate without intervention. And of course, again, to try to help and prevent that situation. And the 4 categories we're looking at are socioeconomic risk factors, operational, environmental, and public health risk factors. And again, we're open to input both on those categories and on the individual factors. So we'll discuss that later in the meeting. And another thing, and I think the final thing I want to emphasize, is that given the scope of this, it's a statewide approach. We can't just look at a certain part of the state. And given that Grace will share the numbers in just a second, I think we're looking at around 2,200 to 2,300 systems in total on the facilities list. We really have to rely, first of all, on a quantitative approach. Using quantitative data, we're not able to do qualitative assessment of more than 2,000 systems. That's not to say there won't be qualitative assessment, and of course, more detailed quantitative assessment of systems that are identified as inadequate in future stages of the work. But because our approach and mandate is statewide, we have to rely on data points that are available for nearly all, or preferably actually all systems on the facilities list, or at least of a certain permit type on the facilities list. Those data that we rely on, because this is, this is a first-time effort, but the goal, the aspiration is certainly to do this kind of effort in the future, is to rely on data that's reproducible and that's likely to be or certain to be available over time. Essentially, we can't rely on purely private data. That doesn't work both because this is a public project and because we meaning the state, are looking to try to reproduce this in the future. And then, of course, any data point, any variable has to be relevant to the inadequacy and risk definitions. And so there has to be an argument or a logic to why it's included, to essentially use the least amount of data that's gives the best picture around inadequacy and risk. We can't just throw 100 factors into an equation. That won't really lead us toward precision, and it won't really lead us towards solutions in the end. So we're trying to use all the data that's relevant and reproducible, but also not make it so complicated that it's hard to reproduce or hard to know what's actually going on. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Grace to lead us into discussion, first of all, around what sort of the 3 different permit types are on the facilities list, but then into more details on both the inadequacy and risk assessment. So I'll turn the floor over to you, Grace.
Yeah, hi everyone. First, I just want to briefly introduce myself. I'm Grace Harrison. I'm a project manager at the Luskin Center for Innovation at UCLA, and my primary role as part of the wastewater needs assessment team has been to work on these inadequacy and risk criteria. So you'll hear a lot from me today. But yeah, as we mentioned, I want to just introduce us to our 3 permit types that we're going to be working with. And all of the data for these has to be applicable to all the systems on the facilities list, or at least applicable to all the systems of these specific permit types. So this is what we're working with, and this is what the data will be informing. So we have our 3 permit types included in the facilities list, which are systems with sanitary sewer order or SSO permits, systems with a national pollutant discharge elimination system or NPDES permit, and waste discharge requirement or WDR permits. So I'll talk more about kind of the differences between these in just a second, but I want to first give you guys a glimpse into just the numbers, the estimated number of systems within each permit type that we will be including in the final facilities list. So we have about 1,000 systems with SSO permits estimated at this point, 260 systems with NPDES permits, and about 1,000 systems with WDR permits. So now let's define what those different permit types are. Ooh, sorry, it's lagged. Okay. So systems with SSO permits are commonly referred to as sanitary sewer systems or collection systems. They are made up of pipes that transport wastewater to a treatment facility to be discharged or maybe to be recycled. One critical aspect of SSO permits is that they regulate sanitary sewer overflows, which are essentially spills of untreated or partially treated sewage from these collection systems. So that's the overview for SSOs. Facilities with National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System or NPDES permits are federally regulated by the Clean Water Act. These systems regulate pollutant discharge into what they call waters of the US, which is a legal term, but broadly encompasses any ocean, river, lake, or stream in California for California specific permits, with some exclusions, but these systems require regular monitoring, and the data of their monitoring is reported to both the State Water Board and to federal EPA because of their federal regulation status. And then waste discharge requirement permits or WDR permits are issued by the state and regional water boards and regulate systems that discharge to land or to surface waters that aren't federally regulated. But WDR permits are really mostly focused on the potential impact a system can have on groundwater quality. And these systems are often smaller in size. So that's your introduction to the different permit types. Now we want to clearly define what we mean when we're calling a system inadequate. Inadequate systems are wastewater systems that do not adequately treat and dispose of wastewater, leading to environmental or public health degradation. This term is not a legal definition and will not be used so at this time. And it is, I want to note that it's directly inspired by California's drinking water needs assessment failure terminology. They use the term failure or failing system, although the term inadequate is a little bit softer and it seems more applicable in the case of wastewater, which is why we're going forward with inadequate. I'm going to ask that all questions are held until the end of this section because we have about 10 minutes for discussion at the end of each module. So you'll have time. The definition of an at-risk wastewater system is the wastewater system confronting circumstances which threaten its ability to continue adequately treating and or disposing of wastewater. So again, we're trying to predict systems that are at risk of becoming inadequate in the future so we can implement interventions and identify funding sources to help these systems. The model to predict an at-risk wastewater system will be refined over time as it was in the drinking water needs assessment as data becomes available or shifts over time. This figure is trying to demonstrate that we're essentially conducting 6 different assessments. So we're conducting unique inadequacy assessments for each permit type. And then we are also conducting risk assessments for each permit type. And again, this is because each permit type is quite different and each criteria used to identify inadequate and at-risk systems really varies from permit type to permit type. We also have this bottom section showing that we will have to identify systems that have insufficient data that we will be unable to categorize into inadequate and at-risk assessments. So systems with insufficient data are most likely to be WDR systems, as these systems, they don't have as stringent monitoring reporting requirements as SSO and NPDES systems. But we also just want to note that we recognize that these systems with insufficient data, in reality, they may already be inadequate or at risk, but without the adequate data available to us, we can't properly evaluate them at this time. So, it's a little bit of a catch-22 there. Okay, so that's the end of this introduction section. We have about 10 minutes, although we are running a little short on time, but I think we can make it work. That we have 10 minutes for questions. So yeah, Jared, I saw your hand was raised and maybe there was another chat. So I'm gonna open the floor to you all. And these are kind of just prompting questions if anyone would like to speak to those in particular. Jared, yeah.
Hi, good morning. Jared Voskuil on behalf of CASA, the California Association of Sanitation Agencies. Appreciated this presentation, Grace, and it's good to see what you have laid out. I had noticed in the next section and the slides beforehand, the NPDES does utilize a legal and regulatory definition, and so I wanted to encourage the SSO to look to that. And I guess 8B 805 kind of starts to go down that road. So as you're kind of planning this out and settling, I think that could be beneficial. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I do want to say, Wajiha, I think we will be addressing your comment, your good question and comment later, especially towards the end of the meeting. But there are multiple pathways through which the location and potential risk of performance of aughts and unsewered communities will be assessed through this project, one of which will be discussed at length in the next meeting and another in the following meeting. But we are, again, trying to balance and integrate it, especially into the solutions and funding analysis, in the rest of the project, but we are trying to balance and give proper space as much as we can, again, in a 3-hour meeting to this part of the analysis. So we didn't want to jam sort of too many topics and go too quickly. Is one level to the answer of your question or comment. We can get into it more later. But I want to, I guess, now turn to Debbie.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Debbie Mackey. I had actually just a comment on, or I have two things. Comment on slide 10 is you put in the excluded reclamation plants, I think is the word you used on there. I just would caution you because we do have a number of wastewater treatment facilities that have reclamation in their title. So not to use reclamation as a divider. You can see that on the excluded in the facilities that don't produce sewage, but just to let you know, if that's what you're using, you might need to look a little bit deeper. And then in regards to your question about the WDRs, one thing, at least a piece of information as you're doing your data that I would suggest gathering is when the last permit was issued. And the reason, not that it might be a good way to help prioritize in the future where future attention is needed, and maybe it doesn't, but I feel like it could come into play. It could come into play on they call this, that program, the non-15 program, but what treatment plants potentially could be at risk, but you just don't have the data, and maybe you would want to look at first. So and I had something else, but if I remember, I'll raise my hand again. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that suggestion. That's great.
Grace, Grace, can I address the reclamation issue?
Sure.
So Debbie, we didn't go by just the names. Every plant that had reclamation in its name, we opened up the permit, and that was probably a bad title. We're really talking about plants that are not treating raw sewage. We're talking about plants that are tertiary and picking up effluent from other plants. And in that sense, they're reclamation or tertiary plants. There's the Edward Little plant in Southern California in the LA area that takes water from Hyperion is an example. There's not very many of those. Almost all the plants you're thinking of that have reclamation in their name, they are in the list.
Yeah. Okay. Super. That it just caught my eye. Thank you.
What'd you have?
Hi, everyone. I have a clarifying question. I'm sorry, I'm not from a technical background. Just trying to understand, is there overlap between the permit types and count? So, for example, if you have SSO, which is a sample size of 1,000, does it include one system can fall under all three of these, or that's not possible? Because I'm just trying to understand if a system is inadequate under SSO, can it also be adequate under WDR, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think if John or Office of Water Programs wants to go into more detail, I'll turn it over to you. But the general answer is yes, there's more. Certainly, some of these facilities, I don't have an exact count, have multiple permits apply to them, and the overlap between them is something we need to reckon with. As we do these analysis, and it's going to be particularly tricky if on one permit type of facility might be deemed as inadequate and on another it isn't. That's a type of complexity that isn't really dealt with in other types of similar needs assessments, especially on the drinking water side, just don't have it. So I don't know, John or others at OWP, if you want to speak to the extent of overlap or crossover between permit types on the facilities list. I don't want to put you on the spot either.
Caitlin or Dakota, do you want to talk about the overlap between collection systems and plant systems?
Sure, this is Dakota. I think what I'd be most comfortable sharing with the advisory group is that in some cases, a facility will have its treatment infrastructure as well as its collection system under a single WDR or MPDES permit. Sometimes the treatment facility will have its WDR and PDS permit, and then there will be associated collection system permits with that treatment facility. And it's really a mixed bag. There's not a one size fits all. So some of them will have overlap and could potentially be in multiple assessments. Some of them would not be. And it's also the case that some NPDES facilities that discharge to surface waters also have aspects of their facility where some of their effluent is discharged to the land surface, and thus they have waste discharge requirements as well to contend with.
Thank you.
To be fair, we don't exactly know how to deal with this yet. We are grappling with it to try to avoid, obviously we want to avoid double counting or undercounting.
Yeah, I would just say a lot of parts of this project require new methods and thinking that we would love, and we welcome all your perspectives on how to do this. But there aren't many models out there. And again, I do want to give a shout out to all the folks at WWP who have been doing amazing work just to get us to where we are on the list, but there's kind of more work to do in that crossover element. I see, and I also want to be sensitive to time.
Yeah, I was just going to say we only have time for one more question. So, but there will be more discussion time. So let's go to Keith. And that will be our last question for this section.
I just think maybe possibly you guys could just let us know if we're straying outside the focus of your intention here, so that we don't drag this meeting down, or we don't hinder any progress that we're all trying to make together. I think that might be good every once in a while, just to keep us in line and keep us on target for what our focus needs to be. I appreciate the work you guys do. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I know all of those questions were great. And the discussion sections, let me go to my next slide. I think it might show us. There's discussion sections after each one of these. So after the SSO section, after the NPDS. So hopefully that will help, really target our questions that we can ask that are specific to those types, and then we'll have our break. So now we want to talk about the inadequacy assessment. And this is only inadequacy right now. We're not talking about risk. So again, the goal of the inadequacy assessment is to identify wastewater systems not adequately treating and or disposing of wastewater. How a system is determined to be adequate or inadequate is based on their compliance with permit orders, such as how they're monitoring and how they're reporting that data. Are they complying with any enforcement orders that they're currently under? These are really the key components that are informing our criteria. The data sources for the inadequacy assessment are, once again, all quantitative, and they're all updated regularly, which is why we're able to use them for this statewide assessment. We will largely be relying on violation and enforcement action data reported to the California Integrated Water Quality System, or CWICS. In the case of NPDS permits, they do report their data to both California water boards and to the EPA. So some of their data is available through federal databases. And we'll also be using data available through the Water Board's Division of Financial Assistance, or DFA, and pulling some data from system's own annual reports that they're also sharing. So these are our main data sources that we are primarily relying on. Oops. So I want to just re-emphasize that we have not finalized the weighting or thresholds for the criteria that we're proposing at this point. This is something that we're definitely open to feedback on from you guys, and is obviously a critical step in developing these assessments. So This is something that's going to be a huge focus in the next couple of months and, as the project continues, but it's not something we're going to be speaking about extensively today unless you all have suggestions on how we can move forward. To determine what the criteria for an inadequate system should be, we worked really closely with selected water board staff who work daily on topics related to SSO, NPDS, and WDR systems. So we first met individually with these experts, and then we formed a small working group of staff who we've been meeting with monthly since about October to help further refine our proposed inadequacy criteria. And these staff members are really hugely critical to our efforts. And we're planning on continuing to meet with them throughout the entirety of Phase 1D, and hopefully they'll continue to be involved and interested. Again, this is our meeting map. We're now going to get into the proposed inadequacy criteria for the different permit types, one at a time. So first up, we're going to talk about sanitary sewer systems, also known as collection systems. The sanitary sewer systems general order regulates systems with an SSO permit, also called sanitary sewer systems or collection systems. And under this general order, SSO systems are required to report any sanitary sewer overflow, which are also commonly called just spills. And spills can vary in severity. The smallest spills are categorized as Category 4 spills, and the most significant spills are categorized as Category 1. So if a system, had any of those types of spills, they are required to report that. If a system did not experience any spills during a quarter, they would also still be required to report a no spill certification that certifies that no spills occurred. These systems also have to submit and publish a sewer system management plan every 5 years. And they also publish their annual reports that really cover the functioning of the system as a whole. And finally, these SSO systems must also conduct and report on regular inspections and cleanings that are done. So based on those requirements that they're held to, we've developed our inadequacy criteria for SSO systems. So this is the proposed, we're going to go one at a time. So the first one is if a system has had an average of 3 Category 1 or Category 2 spills in the last, per year in the last 5 years, that system would be considered inadequate. And remember that Category 1 and Category 2 spills are the most severe types of spills. So that's the first criteria, or 1. Another would be if a system has only cleaned up less than 50% of a Category 1 spill that occurred in the last 5 years. That's another criteria. If a system has not submitted a sewer system management plan in the last 5 years, or the plan that exists is older than 2018, that would meet the inadequacy criteria. If a system has not submitted a no spill certification for an entire year, that would also make them be considered inadequate. And this is kind of getting at just an overall lack of reporting that would indicate potentially, some more serious issues. And similarly, if the system has not submitted an annual report for the entire year, that would be that would also meet the criteria. So the second bit of this is focused on enforcement orders. So we've received feedback that a notice of violation, which essentially is just notifying the system that they have violated something, it's also called an NOV, is a good indicator of if the SSO system is struggling, because staff are regularly reporting NOVs for SSOs. So we're looking for feedback specifically on the number of NOVs that a system, if a system has received X amount of NOVs, that is the threshold for inadequacy. We're looking to you all if you have thoughts on that threshold, what it should be. And then we also, the next set of criteria here are these other enforcement order types. And so if a system has had one of these enforcement orders that's open over the last 5 years of any of these types, that system would be considered inadequate. And I can go one at a time through these for those of you who aren't familiar with them. An administrative civil liability order means that the system is receiving some sort of financial penalty for violating regulations. And then a cleanup and abatement order means that there are unresolved compliance issues that require immediate cleanup of contamination. A cease and desist order means that the system has to stop an activity that's violating the regulations. And then a time schedule order requires that the system outlines a plan to address existing violations. So these are ordered in severity, but we're treating them all equally at this point, with just saying if you have one or more of these that were active. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the SSO criteria. So we have another 10 minutes for questions that are specific to this SSO criteria. Paul.
Yeah, I'm concerned about 5 years. If a site had 15 spills 5 years ago, you're still calling it inadequate. And that the slide that told us the difference between inadequate and risk was that inadequate was supposed to be current. So at the most extreme, the option would be if there is an active, unclosed violation at the moment that you take account, then that's inadequate, or a report hasn't been filed, that's inadequate. But if they had a problem 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago that has been solved, then God bless them, that's not inadequate anymore. I do see if they had a lot of violations, they would certainly be at risk of another one. But that's a starting thought. The other thought I have is there are these inspections and they find things. And it's not clear how that, if they find a bunch of leaks, cracked pipes, we do have earthquakes from time to time in this state and other reasons why pipes would crack and start leaking into the subsurface, then that would be inadequate and the inspection should be finding that, and there would be a period of time until it gets fixed, and they're inadequate until it's fixed. Those are some thoughts.
Yeah, I'm going to address your second comment first about the inspection data. The inspection data that we have seen is pretty hard to use in a quantitative assessment because it has so much written content and details, really about what occurred in the inspection and what has been seen. And so it's hard for us to operationalize that sort of data to this kind of statewide assessment where we're working with 1,000 SSO systems. So that's why it isn't currently included in this criteria. But if there's ideas on how to better operationalize it, then we're definitely open to those. And I'll pass to Greg because I see it has his hand up too.
Yeah, I mean, again, I just want to say these are the types of comments we want to hear, both with respect to there's always going to be discussion. You'll get different things depending on the time frames you use, and there's different arguments for different time frames, but we want to hear yours. So right now, this is framed in a way that we and others at the board thought was most reasonable as an initial proposal, but there are different arguments for real time, which by the way requires a lot more work to update or 1, 3, 5 year thresholds, and different timeframes are in different regulations too. But again, to say we welcome those comments. And the second, I think, was also a great comment. Does get more tricky. I mean, Grace covered the inspection data part of it, but around sort of, who's responsible, and to use a researchy term, kind of like if there's outside factors that are impacting a system, we don't want to unfairly, I think, label a system as inadequate or say that they did something wrong to be inadequate or at risk. They may still be inadequate or at risk, but it may not be their fault. But there's distinctions there that are really important that I recognize and I think you're getting at. But I know we now have 3 hands raised, so why don't we just go through maybe all 3 of your comments and try to take them any responses in a batch, I'd say. I don't know whose hand was raised first, though.
I think Debbie.
Okay, thanks. I just want to make some comments on the proposed criteria. On the first, you had it on the first bullet that average of 3 category 1 or category 2 spills in the last 5 years. I don't know if that's going to completely get to it. I realize that those are the worst type, but it also doesn't account like a small system versus a very, very large system. That number you might want tiers based upon that. And then on the second one, the one that kind of made me think a little bit more about that is spill recovery for category 1. If that happens during a dry weather event, you would expect that to be really good. It happens during a wet weather event. In some cases, that water is gone. There's no way of recovering it. And so I don't know if that really gets to the adequacy versus the location of the system. And I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, thanks. Nell?
Yeah, I guess kind of adding to what Debbie was just saying about the average of 3 category 1 or category 2 spills and the size, excuse me. One thing I was wondering is whether it would make sense, since these are collection systems, which some of them are more and less extensive, if you might consider doing sort of a number of spills per unit of length of pipes or what have you, like, or size of the collection system in some way, because I think a very large system with 3 spills per year is going to have a potentially very different, I think, inadequacy implications than a very small system with 3 spills per year.
Yeah, I do want to just really quickly say yes to that. And also, we've heard that already, and yes. So, and also shout out to your excellent report from a few years ago now in this space. So, Jared?
Hi, really good discussion and appreciated this presentation. Kind of, I liked what Debbie mentioned in terms of, having this be, proportionate to system size and controlling for that. I also think there's factors like seasonality when you're really looking at these incidences that count. A lot of this is outside of control of the operators, things like wet wipes, or illicit discharges. And also, I think factoring for that, once you kind of get a universe of incidences, is important. Also, the spill recovery, there could be factors that impact that. And so maybe as a preliminary matter, the 50% would be like a criteria, but then there's further evaluation of the incident before it really gets counted on that side. I also just want to recognize, I think this is really good as you're talking at the state board and developing these topics and criteria. Your Office of Enforcement team at the board, has its approach for when they identify, actions against agencies. And so I think that's helpful. I'd also say, though, put it out there as an offer as a representative of the wastewater community that, we have agencies that work on this very daily and very locally, and they are bound to regulatory compliance. So they have a very different perspective that's so much more local on managing these. And I want to encourage that kind of reach out from the board to hear that evaluation. I can't convey that in any way that somebody who's actually on the ground and popping the manholes and repairing these pipes and cleaning up these spills can. But in addition to those folks that I want to encourage you to connect to as you're defining these, we also have consultants who are brought in by these agencies to really help them. And they have insights, probably more from a triage standpoint, that really gets to some of the critical nature of this work. And I think those lessons learned could be really valuable for your team as you're identifying kind of what you said in an earlier slide with these high need systems that are really part of the purview of the needs assessment, although not the entire purview. But really think this is good work and happy to continue to support the development and evolution of this definition.
Great. Thanks, Jared. And we have time for one more question, so we'll end with Keith.
Yeah, so to the state water board fellows that appreciate the work you people do up there. I sit on the EJAG, which is with the Valley Air District. It's advisory group for environmental justice, and we had a meeting last night, and I was just making sure that the state water board stays up with the current trend of technology that's coming hard and fast. We discussed this last night at the district, and just I just want to know if you guys have systems in place that are intentionally established to deal with these new technological changes and all the technology that's available that could deal with some of these issues we're discussing in this waste management advisory group. Also, do you have any specialized mandates that kick in when people are dealing with these disasters like the wildfires and earthquakes and et cetera? Thank you.
So I'm not sure if we have time to fully address those questions right now. And I don't want to necessarily put one of the water board staff on the spot, but we might be able to come back, or maybe we could talk about that more in the breakout groups or during an office hours session, because it's obviously an important question. But yeah, I just don't think we have time to fully get into all that. So I'm going to move forward into the NPDES question, but thanks for asking it. Okay, let me move through these one more time. Okay, here we are. So the NPDES criteria is next. Oops, sorry. Crazy slide control. So NPDES systems, as I mentioned before, they're unique because they're federally regulated under the Clean Water Act. And because of this, EPA has a designation that they designate systems that are significantly out of compliance with monitoring and reporting requirements. So they call them significantly non-compliant, or SNC, or SNC. You might hear multiple terms. And so significant non-compliance is for systems with the most serious level of violations and indicates whether the violation or non-compliance event or events may pose a serious level of concern for the environment or for the system. And an important reporting requirement for NPDES systems are their discharge monitoring reports. These reports are submitted monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, or annually, depending on the specific permit requirements of each system. And a discharge monitoring report should state the discharge location, the volume and type of pollutants, and the volume of the discharge, and then also the pollutants that are included in the discharge. And so because EPA already designates systems as significantly non-compliant, it was recommended to us that we use that same criteria to designate systems as inadequate in our analysis. So the following criteria that I'm going to walk through are how a system is designated as an SNC system, or significantly non-compliant system by EPA, and thus how we're proposing to use this same criteria for our inadequacy assessment. So the first criteria is if a system has failed to submit a DMR for more than 30 days. Again, those are those sort of critical reports that systems are reporting. If they have failed to meet a permit compliance schedule milestone, so if the system missed a time limit that they were supposed to do something to come back into compliance by, and they missed that time limit, then that qualifies them as inadequate. If there has been a violation of a formal enforcement order that was issued, if a system has significant effluent limit violations, and so these are systems that are either 40%, there's two types of pollutant types. There's group 1 and group 2, and I'm not really going to go into the difference here, but essentially if the system is over 40% over the limit for group 1 pollutants, or 20% over the limit for group 2, then they would be that would be a significant effluent violation. And we're looking at if there's been they've been in exceedance of those limits for 2 or more months in a 6-month period, then they are considered inadequate. And then we have if a system has chronic violations. So these are systems that are out of compliance for 4 or more months in a row. And I'm sorry that this slide is lacking in a little bit of the details of kind of how these, what makes up these criteria, but we tried to keep the slides, minimal just for legibility, but feel free to ask clarifying questions if you need. And then in addition to the SNCC criteria on the last slide, it was recommended by the Water Board staff that we also consider active enforcement orders in our inadequacy criteria. These are the same criteria from the SSO slides that we discussed before. And again, if a system has any one of these active enforcement orders, then that would indicate a serious issue. You may notice that we did not include notice of violations or NOVs for NPDES systems. And that was again recommended to us because NPDES systems are so frequently monitored. And staff do have some leniency in assigning NOVs, that staff recommended that NOVs may not be the best indicator of a system's success, specifically for NPDES systems, because some highly monitored systems may have a large number of NOVs, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're inadequate. They're just frequently monitored. So again, we have 10 minutes here for open discussion and another kind of prompting question. If you do feel like NOVs would be important to include in NPDES, then we'd like to hear about that. I'll go back to this. Debbie.
Sure. Actually, the one thing that I was a little bit concerned about was the time schedule order. I think if somebody is, it's on the other page, but I think if somebody is in violation of their time schedule order, then that might be a better indicator. And I'll give you an example. Is we've had treatment plants that have upgraded. The characterization of their wastewater has changed because of that, but the period where they were allowed an in-permit compliance schedule is no longer there. So they're given a time schedule order instead as a way of complying with something that's brand new. And so I say brand new, but it's a criteria that's been around for a while, but it's just recently impacting the facility. And so it kind of, it makes me question if that's the right way to determine if something is inadequate or not, just because there's a time schedule order. And then on the other ones, I know that the EPA criteria is there. I think that there's some significance that needs to be put in there too, because it just because you have, and I think you said, I think that there was a little bit, but again, some of the weighting might be there, and having kind of a sliding scale as to, okay, if this just was a one-time thing versus it happens all the time, is probably really important to understand really which systems are inadequate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, I don't have an immediate response to you, but just noting down your comments, and those are all super helpful. Paul?
I would repeat my concern that 5 years is looking too far back.
Okay.
And
I think it cut out, but
I heard him.
That looking back 5 years is too far. It's ancient history, 2020 at this point. These systems have some of them, if I understood Dakota right, have collection systems that are under the NPDES permit without a separate SSO permit. And so they have collection systems, and those could have spills and the other problems that we just discussed. And I think those, therefore, if I'm right, that some of them don't have an SSO, then the collection spills need to be monitored here as an indication of inadequacy. The notes on the December office hours said that biosolids are handled under these various permits, NPDES and WDR, and so some violations for the biosolids needs to be attended to. Maybe that's covered here, but those are not an effluent limit. They might be some other permit violation. And then to restrict it just to the significant ones that are 40% over the limit for 2 months. Well, the significant also includes at all over the limit for 4 out of 6 months. That may be okay. I'm worried about places that go over the limit. But I do see the trade-offs you're making there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And regarding the biosolids, I do not believe biosolids would be included in these violations. We do talk about biosolids in the risk assessment portion, and we can talk about it more. But yeah, thanks for your comment about potentially including it here in the inadequacy. Let's see, Debbie, and Debbie, I wanted to ask you for the TSOs, would your comment also apply for SSO systems, or are you speaking only to NPDS? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay. Usually only to NPDS. TSOs can occur within the WDR system in permit. They're treated as violations. They're not treated as violations within the WDR system if they are in permit. And so but the compliance schedule policy limits the use of compliance schedules, which is the normal pathway for the NPDES system. So this is just kind of stupid, but on the discharge monitoring reports, you have greater than 30 days. They're due monthly. We have 31-day months. So you might want to just change that.
Noted.
Cool. Jared, well, actually, let me ask Anna because she just raised her hand. She's on our team.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to share a quick question from the chat that Jasmine asked. I just wanted to raise it. She asked, what is considered to be a significant effluent limit violation? Something that is triggers an MMP question mark.
Yeah, and the link that Paul sent is accurate. That is what we're using, or the definition that's in that link would be the definition that we're using. I can talk more about it later, but I want to hear Jared's question also. Thanks, Anna.
Just another comment, kind of similar to the prior one with SSOs and standardizing the evaluation of the system. Maybe exploring its, permitted flow is an important thing to consider, as well as maybe the agency's O&M budget. So factoring that into some of these, maybe not the criteria here, but on the next side with the violations would be important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those both pop up in the risk portion. So yeah, we can have another conversation about if it fits better here or there. Minu, I'm going to hold your question so we can move forward because we're at time, I believe, for this section, unless I miscalculated. But yeah, let's move on and then there'll be another chance for questions. Okay, so for WDR, we're moving on WDR criteria. Systems with WDR permits, they have less monitoring and reporting requirements. So that data is less readily available for our assessment. And additionally, WDR systems, they don't have clear definitions or criteria of significantly non-compliant like NPDS systems do. So they're kind of the trickiest group of system types or permit types. So we're heavily relying on our working group of water board staff to help us understand what the most critical violations are to identify these inadequate WDR systems. So the following tables are essentially have different violation types. So it's laid out a little bit differently. And again, these different violation types, we're not proposing any weighting or thresholds at this time, just simply the violations that we've identified as important for the inadequacy criteria. So this first table is showing which violations we're proposing, one of 4 slides. And so we're not proposing, again, not proposing the weighting, but the first violation type is an unauthorized discharge violation, which means that the system has discharged waste without the correct permit, or they've discharged waste in a way that's other than what is described in the order that they're under. And then the second violation is if the system has not been reporting their monitoring regularly or completely. And then we have if the system has violated their groundwater basin plan by discharging waste to groundwater in exceedance of the receiving water's pollutant limits. So if the receiving body of water has a pollutant discharge limit and the system has discharged in exceedance of that limit, then that is what this violation is getting at. And then the fourth violation is if the system has a rate of wastewater flowing through it in exceedance to what is permitted or the designed capacity of the system. This is here because it can lead to overflows or inadequate treatment. And then the last 2 violations on this table are both effluent limit violations. So they're given if the system has exceeded permitted levels of total suspended solids, often called TSS, or settlable solids in their discharge. This next table is all effluent violations, and these violations we're looking at pH levels, oil and grease removal, different types of nitrogen removal during treatment, and other inefficiencies in treatment facilities, reduction of organic pollutants. The third table is also all effluent violations. We have biochemical oxygen demand, often called just BOD, ammonia and E. coli and fecal coliform violations. So again, these are all the different violation types that we are proposing to include at this point, and we're not, we haven't quite worked through the weighting and thresholds for these. But finally, we are again at our enforcement orders. So the working group did recommend including NOVs, but they recommended looking at the past 10 years rather than 5 years in this case for WDRs. And then the other enforcement order types are the same that we've seen again. And so, yeah, that's the end of this criteria. I know there's a ton here and quite specific content, but if anything raised a red flag for you, or there's any violation types that you think are missing from this list, those would be things that we would be interested in hearing about.
I just do want to note that I think we all would love if we could simplify the violation sort of spectrum for WDRs. We did our best to do so, but it's inherently more complex than for the other types. So we welcome additional ideas there. I know it's a lot. But with that, I know we now also have 3 hands raised. And who was first?
I think Debbie.
Okay, I want to first start with a question because maybe that will help with this is on the TSS and the other ones. Are you looking at their water quality data, especially as you're looking at groundwater, or are you looking at I know that you can look at the violations. I just was wondering because I know a lot of that comes in not on a database.
Right. Yeah. So primarily we'd be looking at violations. If there's not a violation, but we're lacking data for the system as a whole, then we could potentially look into the water quality data that I believe the monitoring data that should be in the annual reports. And I haven't seen those. I haven't looked at them closely, but that would be sort of a secondary look rather than the primary data source would be the violation data.
Okay. So, and then just a couple other, just minor, I want to say more minor things is that, on the groundwater quality, just to make sure that it's, depending upon, I think if the board determines that it's a violation, that's really easy. But if you're just looking at effluent, comparing it to, and then trying to compare it to, to the groundwater quality, that might not be a violation because there's removal in other areas and points of compliance and compliance periods that all go into effect. I'll go into that. And then just another note is on the flow violations. Sometimes it's influent, but in many cases, it could be effluent too, because that is on the NPDES. It's about what comes out of your plant, as that's what you're limited. And so some of the permitting has transferred that way.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Keith?
Yeah, I'm not out of line here. I don't want to derail this, but I'm just curious as to if you have flows from watersheds during high volume rain events or systems or storms, and or how the impact of those interact with your violations or meanings that you interpret it when it's like in shallow watersheds versus deeper watersheds. I know we have some above cork and clay in the valley that are shallow watersheds. I'm just wondering if you guys take any of that into consideration from natural events that might impact some of those flows, if they're in stream flows or next to river flows or RV park flows, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's an important comment. It's not something that we're currently proposing including, again, because there's just such a large number of systems, and we just haven't looked at that data yet. But I'd be happy to bring it back to the team and talk more about it because, yeah, it is an important point. Minu?
Yes. Slide number 51. I just want to point out a few things. One is as you assess the data in the future, I think to align with EPA for the microbials, it will be enterococci and E. coli. So you might actually see the fecal coliform violations sort of disappear in the future. And the data might dissipate and be more focused on E. coli and enterococci. So just want you to be cognizant of that. And then I think in the future, like I said, to align with the EPA criteria, I think it's going to be E. coli. So I don't know if you need to adjust your documents based on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just both, looking forward as well as, again, speaking to what I commented on earlier. In some cases, we have to, for the first of these slides, aggregate some of these, and we know that those three things are not synonymous. So and we'll be exploring that complexity in the future. But thank you for giving us the heads up about future regulations.
Yeah. Any other questions? We have a couple more minutes here.
I just wanted to have that last commenter. That was really good information she brought up, and I just missed part of it, the misunderstanding of what she was saying about we're going to have how did the fecal coliform, how is that going to be changed? Could you just kind of just give a little bit, kind of help me understand what you meant by that?
So currently, for surface waters, the monitoring is labeled as from EPA, either E. coli or fecal coliform. And that's regulatory monitoring, and it's also voluntarily monitoring that the wastewater treatment plants might do. And a lot of the wastewater treatment plants will actually do fecal coliform because that's currently required. but they are not specific enough. So voluntarily, they will be going to, they do monitoring for E. coli, and they submit both sets of data to the EPA, whether it's under their regulations or as additional data. And what has been determined is that for risk assessment for human risk, E. coli is a better indicator. So EPA is adjusting that for groundwater, surface waters, and then keeping enococci for recreational waters and marine waters, because that is also, enococci has also been aligned with human risk, but now they're seeing that E. coli aligns better than fecal coliforms.
Thank you so much for that. I understand now. Thank you.
Great. Any last questions or comments? Debbie?
Yeah, sorry, just again on the TSOs, you got to kind of take a look at that. This is going to be a little bit different because they could be within the permit, and they were intended to be in there. And so if it's a TSO that's outside of the permit, then that could be a bigger red flag.
Okay. All right. I'm going to bring us forward. We now are at our 10-minute break, which is exciting. And so that's the end of the inadequacy criteria portion. So when we return from the break, we'll be focusing on the risk assessment, and then we'll be going into our breakout groups. And you'll have additional time for discussion, both after the risk criteria and then obviously during the breakout groups. So yeah, I guess 10 minutes from now will be 11:07. So we'll come back then. Unless, Ariana, do you have any last things, or is that good with you?
So yeah, that works 11:07, and we could put that in the chat.
Great. All right, thanks.
Well, Grace is back, but she is also dealing with technical difficulties. So I'll turn it back over to you, Grace.
Yeah, that was weird. My Zoom app closed at 11:07. That was bad, bad vibes, but we're back. Okay, so we're gonna move forward. Hope you all enjoyed your break. I don't think I have slide controls anymore, Ariana, after I rejoin for some reason. So I'll just ask you to do the slides. But yeah, hi everyone, welcome back. Oh, there we go. Thank you. We are gonna get started on the discussion of the risk assessment. So here we go. All right. So the goal of the risk assessment is to identify systems predicted to be at risk of becoming inadequate in the future based on variables within the following risk categories: socioeconomic risk, operational risk, environmental risk, and public health risk. So here's our figure again, showing the different types of assessments. I want to highlight that we're grouping systems into 3 different categories in the risk assessment. So first we have our systems that are at risk, then we have systems that are potentially at risk, and then we have the not at risk of inadequacy. You're likely wondering what the difference between these categories is, or at least the first 2. And at this point in our work, we have not determined what the risk threshold will be exactly for a system to be considered at risk versus potentially at risk. When we start conducting the actual analysis and building out our predictive model, we will better, be able to determine what that threshold really should be to distinguish between these two groups. But at this point, we don't have a clear threshold set. And then, of course, our last group are the systems that are not identified as at risk or inadequate. And this is great. These are the systems that are functioning as they should be and are not experiencing any circumstances that are putting them at significant risk. So to begin developing the risk criteria, we consulted with our internal wastewater needs assessment teammates. We used, our experience working on California's drinking water needs assessment and our knowledge of available data and literature on this topic. We talked to water board staff. And so in total, after all of this, we identified 39 risk variables that we considered to be included in the risk assessment. In the 4 different risk categories. So some of these risk variables, they did not have accessible data at the scale that we need, or were determined to not directly apply to the scope of the wastewater needs assessment. And thus, we're not recommending the inclusion of all 39 risk variables. We are proposing 24 of the initial 39 variables, and those are the variables we're going to cover today, right now. So most of the risk variables are applicable to all the systems that are included in the facilities list. However, some risk variables are only applicable to types. And so we're going to first go through the variables that are applicable to all permit types. We'll have our 10-minute discussion after this section. I just got a connection unstable, so please just interrupt Greg if I cut out.
I think, you might as well go ahead
we'll
and turn off your camera, as I have done, to try to mitigate.
Yes. Okay, good idea. All right, so first, let's begin with the socioeconomic risk variables. These variables are applicable to all systems in the facilities list, and aim to help us identify wastewater systems serving historically under-resourced communities that may struggle to finance system maintenance and upgrades. And I should also note that these variables are all available at the census tract level and come from the American Community Survey by the Census Bureau. So we're proposing using a household socioeconomic burden indicator, which is used in the which is used in the drinking water needs assessment. This indicator combines poverty prevalence and housing burden indicators together to create sort of a new indicator and a composite score of those 2 variables. Next, we're proposing including measurements of incomplete household plumbing. Then we have measurements for disadvantaged community status and severely disadvantaged community status as defined by the state of California. And finally, we're proposing including race and ethnicity as a risk variable in our analysis. Next, we have our operational risk indicators. These variables are applicable to all systems in the facilities list and aim to help us identify wastewater systems that may face challenges keeping up with system maintenance and operations. We're proposing to include depopulation and inversely population growth, system governance type, operator certification level, and design flow versus actual flow. And this last variable is trying to get at systems that are overburdened by the volume of waste in the system because it was designed to handle less. Next, we have 2 tables on operational risk variables that are only applicable to SSO systems. And they might be applicable in content, but because we don't have data available, or applicable in content to some of the other permit types, but we don't have data available for all of the permit types. We only have data available for the SSO systems. So we're proposing to look at relative capital expenditure costs. So what are the capital expenditures of a system relative to its size? Similarly, we have relative operation maintenance budget, which is the budget for running and maintaining the system. Next, relative system capacity. This is slightly different from the other variable, looking at design flow versus actual flow. This variable could identify other systems that are not currently exceeding their design flow, but with an increasing population may do so in the future. And the last variable in this table is systems where more than 40% of the system infrastructure is older than 1950. And then the last 2 variables relevant for SSOs only are getting at cleaning and inspections. So if less than 15% of the system has been cleaned annually, that would be an issue. And if less than 10% of the system has been inspected with a camera in the pipes, then that would also, be a problem. And that's why these are all included. So that's for the operational risk variables. Oops. Oh, actually, I forgot. Yes, we do have one operational risk variable that's only applicable to NPDS systems. And that's because NPDS systems report so much more data on discharges than the other system types. So we have just more available data on this. And this variable is looking at if an NPDS system is discharging into a body of water that may have tightening pollutant limits in the future because of its status as an impaired water body. Some systems may struggle to keep up with, these tightening regulations. Moving on to the environmental risk criteria, these variables are also all applicable to all systems included on the facilities list. We're proposing to look at 5 different environmental impact variables: drought, flooding, sea level rise, extreme heat, and wildfires. These all aim to identify systems that may be at risk of impacts from one or multiple of these environmental hazards. We also have one environmental risk factor only applicable to NPDS systems. Again, this is because of the NPDS systems regularly reporting their discharge monitoring data. So we're interested in facilities that have an increasing instances of near discharge limit exceedances. So, we can see in the data that a system has maybe been trending up, their effluent limits, or their effluent numbers have been trending up, down, or maybe they're remaining the same. So we're looking at facilities that they're trending closer to those limits. And lastly, we have our public health variable, which is applicable to all systems. We are interested in systems that may have constituents of emerging concern in their wastewater, which I believe biosolids would be included here. And so that, that those may be potentially impacting public health. So that brings me again to the discussion section. I can definitely go back to specific slides if people have questions. But yeah, would love to hear your thoughts. We have about 10 minutes. Debbie.
Sorry, I feel like I'm always starting off, so apologize to those others. Just a couple questions. Well, first with a question is how will you be assessing incomplete plumbing? I didn't know that information was available.
Yeah, so there's a variable in ACS that looks at household plumbing. And essentially it's looking at if the house has a kitchen sink, a shower, a toilet, I believe, and potentially a couple other things. But it is included in that ACS survey, and we'd be using that data.
And the ACS, again, is the American Community Survey, which is a product of the U.S. Census Bureau.
Okay, great. Okay, and then one of the things on the SS, especially on the SS, the sanitary sewer collection systems, is that when you look at budget and capacity, I want to just warn you that some systems are going to be different because they have different responses. Some have laterals, some only have main lines, some are only getting sewage from point A to point B. And so what they look like might be different. And so that might not totally go to, so you might want to include that information so you can tease it out in case it does become important. And then some of the stuff that you had only on the NPDS stuff side, I would say also applied to the WDR side. It's not just to constituents of emerging concern. There might be a new regulatory requirement that puts in there, and and so I was almost going to suggest you put in a category for regulatory actions, whether it's for public health purposes or for environmental health, to protect the environment and aquatic species if you're discharging to surface water. So
this is the one you're referring to, is that correct?
Okay, so you said that, yeah, this was the one. This could be applicable to both WDRs and I know you have it under, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense. I'm forgetting what our data looks like on this for the WDRs. That might be why it's not included, but it's good to note it because it definitely is applicable to them.
It's one of those. It's going to be hard because it'll start getting implemented as the permits are being renewed, and there's there definitely is this is a big area in the WDR area that could put people at risk. So yeah, I'll stop here. I see a lot of comments.
Yeah, I think let's again go through. Sorry, Grace. All that we have here, and I also have noted Nell's comment, but let's maybe hear from everyone and then try to tackle.
Eric was next.
Is that a cue? All right. Hi, everyone. Eric Oriana here with Community Water Center. I just had a question around the socioeconomic factors, and I think one of the factors the State Water Board used in developing their socioeconomic indicators was, I believe it was rate. Like they consider rates and what they consider an affordable rate. And so I was wondering if that was a consideration that you all were thinking through for this particular category.
Yeah, we definitely considered rate data when it was included in those kind of a larger set of variables. But because of the lack of data, we are opting to exclude it at this point. If that changes in the future or more data becomes available, then it would definitely be included. And Greg, maybe you want to speak to it more, but I'll just leave it at that so we can get through more questions too.
Yeah, I'd say that's all accurate, although we also anticipate that there may be data that we are going or maybe made available. We may be playing a role in helping produce it, but under a separate project, sort of mandated by SB 1157, that has a similar timeline. And that also, relates in part to the answer to Nell's question. There's a separate project, and I might call on Eric Porce if he's on the line to say more about, related to the impacts of drought on both drinking water systems and wastewater systems, that will provide some rich context, especially for the best indicators to use for drought. There's a lot of indicators for drought, and yeah, we're also open to sources that you all have in mind. And of course, there's a risk, especially with a topic like drought or some of these other climate hazards, to over-identifying systems in a generic way as at risk. So we sort of have a wealth of different ways to measure that, and we want to hear what you all think and think really hard about what's best to include here.
Let's go to Paul.
I appreciate you mentioning biosolids under emerging concerns. They certainly have the PFAS that EPA just came out with, and microplastics and other things that will be emerging. But then there's also existing biosolids rules and regulations that could be violated. And I think those needs to be enter into both the definition of at risk and of inadequate if the biosolids are not, when the biosolids are not being handled properly. And then to the extent there are collection pipes for NPDES permitted systems that don't have an SSO, then those inspection and cleaning rules would apply to those, not just to the SSOs. I'm not sure what data you have on either the biosolids or those inspections, but those are important issues.
Yeah, the biosolid data would be just from whatever the water board is able to provide us with, and then the inspection and cleaning data comes from the SSO database, essentially on CWIX. So that's where that data is coming from. But yeah, writing down your comments. Thank you so much.
On public health,
yeah,
what a lot of people think of when they think of wastewater and public health are feces on the streets and hepatitis. And I mean, it's in the news and it is a concern. And it's not addressed by better sewage treatment plants or collections. It's addressed by the availability of public toilets, where necessary, portable toilets. And I think we have to find a way to include that system in order to have a complete view of public health and wastewater.
yeah. Thanks, Paul. Jared?
Hi. Several comments here. The first one was just so much good detail on the risk, and want to encourage this same level of detail of risk for when you're kind of conducting that septic system evaluation. No, it's different than this piece of it, but wouldn't want to see that not have as good of work here, the rigor. On the socioeconomic status, I am looking for the document. I'll send it over after I find it. But North Carolina, their Department of Environmental Quality undertook a very rigorous evaluation for assessing affordability for the purposes of awarding funding under their Clean Water State Revolving Fund. It's something we're kind of looking at for our own work here in California with that fund, but definitely a lot of great ways to kind of get at these issues. Not just depopulation, but unemployment, ability to repay, project cost per capita rates, all really important stuff for considering this. So I'll send that resource over. I'll also note on the rate discussion, until you really have a sense of what the rates are, it's hard to do a lot of this. And so we're actively working to pick up the thread from where the water board's data left off in 2018. There is existing data, and I would kind of encourage at least the use of that, but we're going to try to backfill that with our membership and get more information there to inform this analysis. So that's our commitment. I thought the operational factors you put out there were really good and got to the nuance of evaluation and assessment. So wanted to flag that. And then on the permits, I think it was the next one. You selected BOD and nutrients as two items to flag. There's so many things we're regulated for, and we have to comply with those regulations. So I would just note that, insofar as BOD or nutrients are flagged, like it should be internal to that permit, the standards that are in there. And, as far and as best as I understand, those permits are, routinely having information uploaded monthly to CWIX, documenting compliance with the permit standards. And so I want to make sure that you're using what's in a permit to evaluate a facility, not generic numbers or broad numbers, but something that's actually regulatorily based. And then finally on biosolids, the water board conducted a statewide investigation. Again, I'll share this resource, but their conclusion on the biosolids part of it was that it was not an area of high risk or moderate risk. It was something that they kind of put a green cell on, like a stoplight. It wasn't a yellow, it wasn't a red. And so the state's conclusion was where we are was fine on that front, but also happy to share an immense amount of research our members are doing to kind of really underscore that and evaluate this issue, because it is, fundamental to what treatment plants do. Every human on the planet, or at least in America, every human here contributes 66 pounds of biosolids, to the systems individually. It's a byproduct. It's inevitable. And some of the contaminants that were mentioned, we don't use those in wastewater treatment. We're passive receivers of it. And so as we kind of contemplate what are the risks, seeing that water board's conclusion, I think should reassure the folks here that, we're moving forward in the right pace on that one. Thank you.
We are at 10 minutes, but Greg, I want to, let you speak for a second.
Okay, well, really quickly, appreciate all of what you just said, but certainly welcome the reference, the specific North Carolina DEQ process you're describing. They're great. Know some people there and welcome seeing exactly. Maybe we've seen it, maybe we haven't. But also the task sometimes is easier for them to get particularly not rates, but other financials data because of the way that governance-wise, both their drinking water and wastewater systems are structured, and the way that rates are collected from other agencies within the state. But all that to say, again, anything we can learn from them and what you're describing, please pass on. And why don't we try to let Minu and Keith quickly comment, and then we can move on?
Yeah.
Grace, I really appreciate the thoughtful slides, and some of them are really specific. And having said that, slide number 64, you said waste to handle, less waste. And being specific, I wonder if you were considering, instead of less waste, maybe higher flows or lower flows, maybe based on flows as opposed to waste, or include flows in there. Have you considered that?
So are you referring to the design flow versus actual flow? Or am I looking at the wrong thing?
I think it was slide number 64, and you just said waste, the handle. So I was wondering if you meant actual, measurement of waste based on flows or solids. What kind of specificity are you saying when you say measuring waste? Less waste, the criteria for less or waste.
I believe it would, well, I don't know. I'm not sure. Honestly, I don't want to give you an answer that's incorrect because I'm not 100%, I'm not seeing it on here where you're referring to. I guess if someone else on my team is seeing it.
Well, regardless, I don't want to, I don't want to bog down into it, but I was saying maybe include language on flows as opposed to just speaking into waste as well.
Okay.
And then
yeah, the difference between those.
Yeah. And then slide number 68, you talked about environmental hazards. I wonder if there was any thought or consideration given to, based on some upcoming challenges that we might have for environmental and to improve local preparedness, if there was any language included for like adaptive infrastructure for what might come up in the future.
Yeah, that's definitely important. At this point, we don't have it included, but I think it's an important comment and something we can talk about trying to include because it's definitely relevant.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Keith.
Yes, I'm sorry. This is just a observation on the silos and the differences. I'm working on a project right now on an ag project with Lemoore NAS at the Lemoore Naval Air Station out here. And they have a wonderful wastewater system that they've built, modern, that's about 7 million gallons a day, treated wastewater. And I don't know if you guys have any interest at all. I don't know if you interact with any of the federal systems at all that are in place, but I know we do have a tendency to want to silo these things. But I could offer an opportunity for the state people to meet the people at NAS if they're interested.
Yeah, I think we'll have to talk about it with the state staff, but thanks for the offer. And I'm going to move us on to our next slides. Thank you all for your feedback just throughout these discussion sections. That's been super helpful. And now we have a longer breakout group section. And so we have 3 different breakout groups. You all are receiving the same prompts and the same kind of prompting slides based on feedback from the last AG meeting. But we do recognize, these are just prompts and you can take the conversation in whichever direction you'd, kind of like, fitting into the scope, obviously, of today's conversation. But do feel free to ask your own questions and not be limited only by our prompts. We're going to ask that 1% each group has shares out for the group, and then our share out session will probably be less than 30 minutes just because of time constraints, but we'll do our best there. So yeah, let's get into our breakout groups. Oh yeah.
Yeah, there's really nothing like 3 hours on a Friday to bond over. But we really appreciate everyone's time and thoughts here.
I think the screen is back on, and then just a reminder for note takers to please save the transcript so that we could take notes and then share those notes out after the meeting. But I'll hand it back to Grace to facilitate.
Yeah, and just as a time check, so we want to leave about 5 minutes at the end of the meeting to talk about the next meeting. So we'll probably have like 20 minutes to debrief here. And I will start, I guess the way we can do this is, oh, can we go to the next slide? That's the like sharing. Yeah, there we go. So our designated speakers from each group can give us just a short overview, and then we can pause. And if other folks have reactions or follow-ups to that debrief, then yeah, we can kind of go one at a time. So let's start with group one, which I believe was my group, and Kayla will be sharing for us.
Alrighty, y'all. Hello. Once again, I'm Kayla and I was in group one. And based on our discussion on the first question around the framework, whether it was clear or not, there wasn't much anyone against it. So it seems like there was a clear understanding of the framework. However, there was also a few concerns and suggestions towards the framework. So in my team, someone was concerned that some systems may be considered inadequate for having certain violations, which may make it seem like the inadequacy process might be given too quickly for certain systems. And that can be based on like, for example, like system size or scale, etc. So that was one concern. In the next question, as if there was any variables missing or data that should be excluded, our team noticed or brought up a history of violations. So noting if a certain system has a history of violations, how is that history? Is it, for example, is that history portraying a consistent, repetitive pattern of violations or not? And whether or not, if it falls under a repetitive pattern, maybe we can look into it in considering it as inadequate. Another team member also suggested approaching this inadequacy process with a deductive versus inductive approach for the inadequacy criteria. So just giving another point of view of how we can approach this and build upon it, and considering both approaches to note any big differences or significant differences. And then last but not least for that question, someone also brought up the suggestion for dignified collection systems. So this is in terms of access to toilets, whether or not certain toilet systems are adequate enough. For example, women's bathrooms tend to be longer than others. But overall, just trying to emphasize a dignified collection system. And then for the third question, weighting and thresholds, our team was discussing system sizes again. So whether or not a system size is big or a grander scale, it will impact the operation and management costs, and how would that reflect on their adequacy and their performance. Someone also mentioned weighing in affordability factors. I think that was also brought up during the presentation about rates and how much it would be the cost associated to the resident themselves. So affordability was also a big topic in our group. And then the last point I would bring up is the risk category. I'm going to pass it over to anyone else on my team for that as we were wrapping up. But basically adding a risk category for a risk category of regulatory or subcategories. But yeah, that wraps up what we had discussed in our group. If anyone else would like to share in or clarify, please feel free.
Kayla,
Thanks,
I'll just
Kayla.
oh, go ahead.
Nope,
Grace.
go for it, Maureen. I was just saying thanks.
Yeah, I think, Kayla, thanks for all that. The risk category of regulatory, what we heard was the idea that it's the regulatory drivers of the drivers of regulations that are increasing costs in particular. So examples were like biosolids and the organic diversions that are problematic for a lot of systems, as well as impact or influences from air quality requirements and that kind of thing. And others on the team feel free to clarify, but I think that covers it, the idea.
Yeah, I think from the regulatory perspective, we just wanted to make sure that we had the representation of that category to allow for us to eventually fill the gaps on the subcategories. That's all.
Great. I'm going to move to group 2, and then if we have extra time, we can kind of do more reactions. But let's hear from group 2 first.
Sure. I am reporting out for group 2, and we kind of jumped around a little bit on the different questions. So I'll just sort of talk about what we talked about and won't necessarily refer directly to those questions. So I think in general, I think we generally felt that the criteria were pretty clear and well organized and systematic. And we had some thoughts about potentially differentiating better between environmental risk and public health risk, or thinking about that or how that might be differentiated more. And basically, the idea was that environmental regulations tend to be, I guess, the specific requirements, the standards tend to be more stringent than some of the public health regulations, and are potentially amended more frequently. And so it might be good to separate out those. Another issue that we talked about is that at least I brought this up. The inadequacy assessment is also kind of a risk assessment. And so I think while the whole presentation was very clear to me, I just wanted to highlight that one thing that you might consider doing to further differentiate and clarify, is you can, leave the inadequacy assessment called that, but I'm thinking the risk assessment, you might want to be a little more specific and call it something like assessment of system risk of inadequacy, because I think when I just saw that risk there, I was thinking, well, isn't there risk? There's risk built into the inadequacy assessment as well. So to some extent, so just brought up that issue of it's kind of a messaging thing more than anything else. Just because I just want to bring it up because my brain went there and got a little confused unnecessarily. So just wanted to highlight that. Let's see here. Additionally, I think we had a number of questions about weighting and how that might play out for some of the criteria. I think a few of us called attention to some of the SSO criteria. We were just wondering sort of how, whether if any one of those things was sort of present for a system, whether that would be sort of a +1 or whether it was going to be +1 for each of them, or how the weighting would work. And we definitely heard that is still a work in progress and that we should all kind of be thinking about that going forward. I don't think we had any specific suggestions or answers on that. Additionally, in looking at the social sort of risk categories, there's questions about how tribes are being considered. And we kind of heard that this is a little bit of a tricky situation, and that definitely where tribal facilities have permits, that they will show up in the analysis that way. But that basically tribes are sovereign entities, and the project team isn't really able to directly coordinate with them. So there's some challenges around that. And then also other in the socioeconomic variables, there are questions about how, if, for example, a particular water system crosses boundaries, say of different census tracts that the data is coming from, kind of how that will be dealt with. And we heard that the actually identifying the system boundaries is still happening. And so I guess they should have those mid-2025. And then I think they'll have to kind of figure out how to work with that, where something falls maybe into multiple categories in different portions of the sort of footprint of the system. And then also questions about how frequently the needs assessment will be conducted. And it sounds like there's currently no decision on that. There's no firm commitment, but kind of the idea is potentially to revisit it on like a 3 or 5 year interval. And so I think that's everything I've got that I've highlighted, but please, anyone else jump in if you've got some additions or changes.
Yeah, does anyone else from our breakout group want to weigh in? That was great now. I think we'll take that as a no for now.
Yeah, that was fantastic. It's great to hear there's really different discussions in both groups, so that's great. Okay, our third group, whoever's our share out person can start.
Hi, everyone. I'll be sharing out for group 3. In group 3, we only got through to 2 of the questions. So we answered, is the framing of the inadequacy and or risk assessment clear? I think there wasn't any concerns about the clarity, but there was a request for the project team or the State Water Board to provide additional resources for advisory group members to become familiarized with the regulatory framework for wastewater systems. And I think one of the solutions or suggestions was for the project team to put together one pager with links to relevant documents. There was a request for clarification about weighting variables and where data to support variables will come from. And so one of the examples that was discussed was the race indicator. And so there was, I think, just wanting to know more of why that would be an indicator that would be considered. And then in operation criteria, they also was discussed what risk they wanted to better understand what risk is trying to be encompassed by system governance. So we talked about some of the challenges that different types of governance systems or districts pose to the operation and maintenance of a system. So we talked about SWRCB and some of the challenge of the lack of governance oversight has led to some of the challenges. And so we tried to look at whether or not small water systems or small systems generally are a risk indicator, or if it's a public or private that poses risks. And then there was also suggestions to consider declining population and bylaws that limit who could serve on boards. And the reason these were brought up was because they limit the availability of people to serve on certain system boards. And then for the second question, we had, the question was, are there variables you think are missing from the inadequacy and or risk assessment? One question was, how will there be overlap between risk criteria variables? How will overlap between risk criteria variables be addressed? For example, socioeconomic status and or race ethnicity. And then there was a suggestion to look at possibly education level of community, which contributes to the availability for people to sit on the board or find adequate staff for certain systems. Also mentioned that disadvantaged communities or SDAC status of a community hopes to look at some of these variables or indicators. There was also another suggestion to look at housing data, the makeup of housing of a community. So looking at whether there's public housing, Section 8, whether a community is primarily rentals, mobile home parks. And there was also a suggestion to look at tribal territories and infrastructure that crosses tribal or non-tribal boundaries. So that was what we were able to discuss for the first and second question for the group. And I'd open it up to the rest of my group if I missed anything.
I think you captured it well, at least for me, but if any other group members have anything.
Keith.
Well, I think I'm hearing a central theme about adding the regulatory piece to it. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, and I just want to re-emphasize, I mean, that was absolutely fantastic. Again, all three groups really covered different things. I think that speaks to everyone's just diverse experience and background. So that's really great. And we really appreciate your time and thoughts to all this. I will pause just for one more moment here in case anyone else has a question or a comment they want to make regarding the breakout groups, but then we'll move on.
I just have one request that Danya, would you be able to make Marina co-host to see if she's able to save her transcript from the breakout room? I don't have any content related questions.
I just wanted to say real quick for oh shoot, I messed up here. I can't remember there's a lot of people in here. Forget it. I'll try to reach out through email. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, if you're referring, well, never mind. I'm not sure what you're referring to actually, and I won't guess. All right, we'll move on then, and I'm going to pass it back to Ariana to talk about the next meeting. So thank you all, and nice to present with you all.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks Grace and Greg for your presentations. We really appreciate it, and as Keith said, really fun to spend 3 hours with y'all. So that's all the content that we have for today's presentation on inadequacy and risk. We're moving on to what we'll be discussing at the next advisory group meeting, which will be April 25th. And I've already sent the calendar invite to advisory group members. And so we anticipate that we'll present on the solutions methodology and then discuss the groundwater impacts assessment, which will look more closely at odds and decentralized systems, which is something that we discussed earlier. And we were initially planning on including that in today's meeting, but as we all can see, we didn't want to try to stack this meeting with too many topics. But that's all we have for today. I say that as if we didn't cover so much content, but if you have any additional questions, advisory group members, please raise your hands and we'll call on you and we'll go through your questions now. And if anything comes up afterwards, please feel free to email me or the project team. And then for members of the public, if you could please just put your questions in the chat, and then after the advisory group members finish their questions, we could read them out if any board members, state water board members are present. But I see Greg, you're unmuted.
Yeah, again, I mean, we have 5 more minutes here. We want to hear all the questions and comments folks have. We will, again, for advisory group members, provide plenty of additional avenues, opportunities to both raise those and discuss those and respond to those. But I do think we do want to more or less end at 12:30 if possible as well, to respect people's time.
Go ahead, Keith.
Would it be okay just to ask a question of the state people that what is their thoughts about these burner toilets that are out there now?
Could you elaborate a little bit more on your question, Keith?
They have these burning toilets that burn the waste.
Mm.
They kind of refer to them as burning toilets. I don't know if I'm using the right terminology, but it's a toilet that you use and they burn the waste. it's burnt with using propane, natural gas. I even believe they got one that's a pellet stove now, but I was just curious if you guys heard of those and what's your reaction to those? What your comment would be on those? Acceptable, not acceptable, something you want to pursue, or never heard of them before?
I personally haven't heard of it, especially since I'm perhaps since I'm not working specifically with NPDES or with the OATS policy, but if this is regarding a new technology and the water boards is open to new technologies, if it proves to be something efficiently that is more efficient and feasible, and the end result is treating what we're supposed to be treating. So it's just we don't supposed to endorse or recommend any particular technology, but communities are more than welcome to contact the vendors themselves or the actual wastewater treatment facilities and investigate these alternatives further. So we are constantly working with new technologies to make all of these permit requirements feasible for everyone. So, but I don't know if Greg, you have heard of these. I have not.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo everything Danya said and also say I think I've heard of these, but I just encourage you or ask you if you'd like us to further respond, and we're interested to just see more details. If you could send it to us, and probably just start with the project team or me, Danya, and Ariana, so we could evaluate and speak to it more fully. But I think we just need more details to see if it, for board response or just for project response.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll reach out to you guys. I'll get
you.
your contacts from Ariana, I suppose. One more quick question, since we're still got some time here, 1 minute. Are we going to see robot waste in the future?
That's another one. Maybe that's an office hours question. I don't know how to answer that at this time.
I know it sounds funny, but they do have to change some of the hydraulic systems on them. So I was just curious.
Yeah, always new frontiers.
I have a general question. I guess it would be for water board staff. With septic to sewer funding for TA providers coming close to an end, is there a direct path forward for additional funding for septic to sewer projects or wastewater projects in the works?
That's a very good question, Oscar. And well, as you know, there is always a tremendous discrepancy in the funding allocated for drinking water projects versus wastewater projects. So it's one of the hopes that as the team starts to work towards developing the reports for these projects, and those reports are going to come in different phases, and they are our intent to make those publicly available as they are ready for viewing. That perhaps there's going to be an incremental push and to try to outline the importance of wastewater projects, not just septic to sewer, but capital improvement projects for existing wastewater treatment facilities that are going to be deemed inadequate, and they are serving a small disadvantaged community. And as it was discussed in many of the groups today, there is only so much those sewer rates can be increased to pay for that capital improvement. So sorry for the long answer, but yes, it's the hope that maybe within the reports and the state water board members attending to these meetings, which is it wasn't exactly the intent. We wanted to make it kind of more just for the advisory group meetings, but that's one of the advantages of having a state board members also attending and high executive management, that perhaps they are going to be able to voice that concern and with the hope of allocating more funding for the FA to distribute to the wastewater projects, and ultimately to technical assistance providers who are doing a lot of the work and with these communities. And probably Greg might want to add something, because I know that has been kind of the ultimate dream of this project, to perhaps being able to steer more funding towards wastewater project.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add at this time, although echo everything you said. And again, there's a clear need. We need to do funding, but I'm almost certain, subject to doing the empirical work, that we will find a gap. And we hope that, speaking for myself, I hope that this project and this effort, it does lead to more funding that's needed in the space, including for septic to sewer projects in the state.
Thank
But
you.
I know it's up to 12:30, so
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. And if there are additional questions, please reach out to the wastewater needs assessment email, and I can pass those on to the team. Otherwise, we'll follow up with the meeting materials next week, as well as some notes covering what we discussed today. But just want to say again that we really appreciate your expertise and you spending 3 hours with us on a Friday. And thank you again to Grace and Greg for a really excellent presentation, and the rest of the project team for being able to be here and share their expertise. So thank you so much.
thank you all. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you. Happy weekend.
Bye.